Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the uh, virtual studio tour with Rowland Ricketts. We will get started in just a moment, so sit back and relax, and we will begin shortly. Thank you. We still have folks coming in, so I'm going to let everyone have a chance to get into the webinar and get situated before we get started. Welcome this evening. We're really excited to have you. So just hold on for about another moment or so. And when the numbers start to level off, we will get started. Welcome, everyone. We have the virtual equivalent of a full house tonight, and we have a jam-packed program. So I'm going to get us started. To start, I'd like to just go over a few housekeeping notes for the program. Some of the information will also be found in the chat. First, the program is closed captioned, which you can access by clicking the CC button or the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. We will also be taking questions throughout the program, so please use the Q&A feature to ask questions of Rowland, and I will pose them to him as we go. As noted, we will share information with you via the chat box. And finally, we ask that you adhere to the SI terms of use and are respectful of the presenters and one another, as well as our community moderators this evening. This program is being recorded and will be on our website for rewatching in the coming weeks. Thank you. And now I am excited to turn it over to the actual program. I'm Gloria Kenyon, Senior Public Programs Coordinator here at the Smithsonian American Art Museum and Renwick Gallery, and I am so delighted to welcome you to today's virtual studio tour with Rowland Ricketts, one of the 4 artists honored in this year's Renwick Invitational 2020, Forces of Nature. The Renwick Invitational is an ongoing exhibition series which seeks to highlight the work of emerging and mid-career craft artists deserving of broader national attention. It is supported through a generous endowment from the Cohen Family Foundation, and this year additional support has been provided by the Carolyn Small Alper Exhibitions Fund, Ed and Kathy Fries, Carrie J. Fries, Van and Cicely Hudson, the James Renwick Alliance, the Chlorfine Foundation, Risa Levitzo Mori, Eleanor Rosenfeld, Myra and Harold Weiss, and the Tokushima Prefecture. For each edition of the Invitational, we bring together a panel of experts to select the artists and theme, and this year, the jury was made up of Nora Atkinson, the Fleur and Charles Bresler curator in charge of the Renwick Gallery, Emily Zilber, Director of Curatorial Affairs at Wharton Esherick House, and Stefano Catalani, Director of Gage Academy. We are especially grateful to Emily for agreeing to be the guest curator for this year's Invitational. Rowland Ricketts creates immersive installations using hand-woven and hand-dyed cloth. His holistic artistic practice begins on his farm, where he cultivates the indigo plants he uses to color his artwork, fully linking his materials and process with the finished product, which we'll see up close in just a moment. For the past 2 decades, indigo has been Rowland's primary medium and subject matter. Using an approach that inextricably links process and outcome, Ricketts works with a farm to gallery concept, an idea more often associated with the craft food movement. He farms his indigo on 6 acres in Bloomington, Indiana, where he also serves as Associate Dean of the Eskenazi School of Art, Architecture, and Design at Indiana University. Ricketts often incorporates soundscapes composed by frequent collaborator Norbert Herber, which uses documentation of the process, such as crinkling of leaves, wind in the field, or tones derived from the variation of shades of indigo as sonic building blocks, as can be found in the work on this year's Invitational, I no Kashiki, Indigo Views. Ricketts also integrates participatory engagement from non-artists into his practice, making the case that indigo belongs to everyone. No one could have anticipated as the show was being developed that we would be entering into a pandemic. Rowland's work is one that is hard to fully comprehend without seeing it in person. So today's program is truly a special opportunity because it allows us to go behind the scenes into Rowland's process to see a part of his practice beyond what's in the galleries. That said, I'm very excited to let you know that the Renwick is reopened to the public on a timed ticketing system, and this exhibition is up until August 15th, and we hope you will be able to visit the work in person. We will provide a link to the ticketing site in the chat. This is our final program produced in conjunction with Forces of Nature, all of which have been generously sponsored by the Smithsonian Women's Committee. We're also grateful to the George Washington University Museum and the Textile Museum for their partnership on this program. And if you enjoy today's program, afterward, please visit our website to view our other virtual programs, including those featuring the other invitational artists. Thank you all for your support and for joining us this evening. And it is now my pleasure to turn the program over to Rowland. Good evening, Rowland.
Thanks so much, Gloria. I'm just going to take a second here and share my screen. All right, so I'd like to say a few quick thank yous. First to Emily Zilber, the guest curator of the Renwick Biennial, and to Gloria and Carlos, Mary Beth, Annie, Karen, and my son Anand, who's also doing some handy phone camera work for us tonight. There are really a lot of folks behind the scenes working hard to make this virtual studio tour possible tonight, including the George Washington University Museum and the Textile Museum, who partnered with the Smithsonian American Art Museum and Renwick Gallery to make this possible. So I want to say thanks to everyone for all the folks behind the scenes who are making this this event happen, and to all of you for joining in. So I want to start with a little bit of background, because the dyeing that I'm going to be showing you today is really just one part of a much longer process. Normally, when people come to visit my studio, they're asking me all sorts of questions that make it really easy and keep an exciting conversation going. So to do the same in this virtual format tonight, once I'm up and moving around the studio, I'd love it if you'd put questions in the Q&A, which Gloria, Mary Beth, or Annie can ask me while I'm moving around and showing you things. So the process that I use starts with a generous handful of seeds each spring, but those seeds really start with flowers and the bees that pollinate them in the fall. When the seeds have had plenty of time to ripen and the plants have been killed by a hard freeze, those seed heads are gathered and they're dried and winnowed. And in the spring, they're planted. For us here in Indiana, that's in late March. And they're planted in seedling beds in a greenhouse to protect them from a late frost. And so these are some of the seedlings growing in the greenhouse this year. And this year we are also experimented with starting seedlings in cell trays to see how that would work. So this was taken this morning. These are the plants that we're growing at home here. And you can see them in the field. You can see the small seedlings that we transplanted there and the drip tape that gives them water. So we put the plants out in the field, usually in mid-May. We just transplanted earlier this week. And we cultivate between the rows until the plants grow. So as they grow up, soil's mounded around the base of the plants. And this plant has a noded stem. So as you do that, it mounds dirt up around the stem, and at each node, it sends out new roots. So it really helps promote the root growth and makes for sturdy, strong plants. And also we grow them close enough together so that as they grow up, they form sort of a green or living mulch over the field to help keep down weeds. So when the leaves are a pretty good size, like you can see here, and the plants are about 2 to 3 feet tall, they're ready for harvesting. And to do that, we just cut them at the base, leaving an inch or two of stem so that they'll grow up again for a second harvest later in the summer. And those plants are, they're spread out in the sun to dry, like you see here. This is out in front of the house. And as the plants dry, the leaves turn blue. So the plants on the left, you can see they're green, but the ones on the right have been out drying for a whole day already. And you can see how the leaves have turned to a very dark blue. The dye in this type of indigo plant is only found in the leaves. So it's necessary to winnow the leaves from the stems in order to make a very high quality dye. So to easily winnow those leaves, we wait for this sort of perfect time when the leaves are dry and brittle, but the stems still aren't. And we quickly gather up the plants, put them in a pile, and stomp on them with our feet to winnow the leaves. And once the leaves are crushed, we remove the stems, first with a pitchfork and then by hand. And all of those remaining leaves are then gathered and we bag them. And those leaves are stockpiled as we work through, like I said earlier, first harvest and a second harvest of the plants each year. All of the stems are mulched back on to the field to help feed future crops. And then in the fall, once all the indigo has been harvested and temperatures have cooled off, we begin the composting process to concentrate the dye found in the leaves. So this involves moistening those dried leaves with water. This happens on a clay surface floor that's designed to wick away any excess moisture from the pile of composting leaves so that the leaves on the bottom of the pile don't rot during this process. The floor is actually dug down about 6 feet deep and it's backfilled with gravel to about 1 foot from the top. And on top of that gravel is a layer of sand followed by a layer of rice hulls with another finer layer of sand on top to hold the rice hulls in place. And then on top of all that goes the clay, which we then wet and we tamp and we wet and we tamp and we wet and we tamp until eventually it starts to form a smooth surface, like you can see there. So the composting process that we're doing on this clay floor is a hot composting process, and at its peak, the pile will heat up to well over 140, often up to around 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Once a week, we turn the pile to break up clumps and add more water and oxygen in order to ensure even composting. Because the pile's hot and it's wet and the outside air is cold, in the winter, the turning process releases a lot of steam. It also releases a lot of ammonia. We keep the pile covered with these burlap sacks in order to help keep it warm so it maintains its heat during the cold winter months. And in order to turn the pile each week, it first has to be uncovered and then it's sort of systematically sliced through. Clumps are broken up, more water's added. And as it's turned, it gets exposed to oxygen in the air. And the pile's then put back in place and it's covered. And then it's left to sleep for another week. Usually about 2/3 of the way through the composting, so many clumps start to form that can't be broken up just using the rakes that we use. The entire pile gets run through a shredder like this. And breaking up these clumps lets extra oxygen and water in that ensures even composting. So in the front here, you can see this very sort of lumpy composting indigo with all these clumps in it. In the back where it's been run through, it's quite smooth. And so we repeat this process of turning the pile once a week for 100 days. And at the end of 100 days of composting, the dye stuff, which is called tsukumo in Japanese, is finished. At that point, it's cooled so that some of the excess moisture evaporates off before it's weighed and bagged for future use. I bag tsukumo in half bales. I'll show you this in a minute. A full bale weighs about 124 pounds. And so our vats are half bale vats, and they use about half of that. I'm going to talk about that more in a minute, but there's a reason that the tsukumo is weighed and bagged as bales or fractions of bales when the composting is complete. And this is because the weight drops off nearly by half when it fully dries over time. So over about a year, 124-pound bale of tsukumo dries to around 60-some pounds, making weight an inaccurate measurement if you're trying of the dye stuff over time. So finally, 10 to 11 months after planting seeds, I'm finally ready to start dyeing things. And if you're familiar with indigo at all, you know that you need three basic things for the process to work. First, you need the indigo itself, the indigo molecules. And you just saw where ours come from the plants that we grow and process. Then you need an alkali because indigo won't dissolve in water. It's not water soluble. And finally, you need reduction, as the dye will only adhere to the fiber in its reduced state. So you just saw where the indigo came from, as I said, so I don't really need to explain that. The alkali that we use in our case comes from burning wood to make ash, and that ash is sifted to remove any charcoal, and then it's mixed with boiling water, and it's stirred, and it's left to settle overnight. This strong alkali is siphoned off, and then the process is repeated using the same ash until we have 5 separate batches of the wood ash lye. I just put this in for reference. The vats hold about 100 gallons, big enough for one of my 13-year-old twins to scare me to death by hiding in them when they're empty. The weakest batches of this wood ash lye, batches 4 and 5, are mixed with lime, which is another alkali. And to that liquid, the sukumo, the composted indigo, is added. And in order to hasten the fermentation that eventually reduces the indigo and makes dyeing possible, we boil a small amount of wheat bran and add that to the vat as food for the bacteria in the composted indigo that cause the fermentation. So every morning and evening for the next few days, the vat's checked and stirred, but otherwise it's left covered. And if all goes well, on the 4th or 5th day, the vat begins to ferment and a purple metallic film starts to form on the surface of the liquid. And kind of as a lucky treat tonight, we actually just started a new vat on Monday, and it's at this exact stage. So you'll be able to see that when I show you the vats. At this point, once the vat starts fermenting, it's only half full and it needs to be filled before we can do any dyeing. So each day over the next 3 days, the stronger batches of wood ash lye are added to the vat, as you can see here, until the vat is filled and ready for dyeing. And after all that work to get from seed to dye vat is done, the dyeing part's actually really easy. You just take the material you want to dye and you wet it out and you immerse it in the vat. And once dyes adhere to it inside the vat, the cloth is removed and allowed to oxidize, and the process is repeated to build up color. And then when the desired shade is achieved, the cloth is simply rinsed and finished. And like I said earlier, because indigo isn't soluble in water, it remains in the cloth while all the other impurities wash out. And for rinsing, all the water that we're using for wetting out and rinsing and so on actually comes from rainwater. So this is the studio, our studio from the outside. You can see it's got this big roof. We collect rainwater off of it first into a first flush tank, which kind of gets rid of any pollen and other bits of leaf and stuff. You can see that. And then it goes into a buried cistern that's buried under the ground there. There's the showing me the water level in the cistern. And I tend to use the water in the rinsing tank until it's black from all the other plant material in the sukumo. And then when I pull the plug and drain it, that water goes into a second cistern that's buried behind the studio. And this was when the studio was being constructed. I wanted to get a picture to remember exactly where it was. And the water from that cistern, sort of the rinse water, all gets runs to a hydrant out in our garden, so we can use it for watering our garden or the indigo field. So this is the hydrant in the garden. And then just like the rinse water, when a vat is out of color or reaches the end of its lifespan, it gets spread back on the indigo field to fertilize future crops. These are really key ideas in the design of the studio because I wanted a setup that reflected the sustainability of the process and made it so that the only thing leaving our property at the end of the day is just the color blue. Everything else gets captured or recycled and reused. So let's head into the studio behind me and I'll show you some of the materials and the dyeing process a little bit more up close.
Rowland, we have a few questions before we get there. Folks are really excited, and I think so many really fantastic questions, and I'll ask some more as we get through the tour because I think you'll talk about some of these. One of the big ones that was asked up top is, what type of indigo are you growing?
So we grow Persicaria tinctoria. This is also known as Japanese indigo. It's native to East Asia, and it's a temperate region indigo. So it grows very well where we live.
And then I think you hinted on it in how you answered that question, but and I didn't touch on it in your bio when I introduced you, but where did you learn these techniques?
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. So I lived in Japan for about 10 years. 2 years of those I spent on as an apprentice in Tokushima, learning about learning to grow and process indigo. And then a second year I spent with a dyer learning to ferment and do that whole process of vatting. And then for a number of years, while my wife Chinami was doing an apprenticeship in traditional ikat or kasuri weaving, we ran a small farm and studio just growing our own indigo, sort of doing what we do now. That's when we really jumped in. But that was, I did that in Japan for a number of years as well.
Excellent, thank you. All right, I have some more questions, but let's get into the studio.
Okay, great. So I wanted to start just by showing you some of the materials up close. So here, this is the dried indigo leaves. You can kind of see what they look like here. Here are some that are still on the plant. And you can see how the stem doesn't have any color, but the leaves do. And this is what we compost down into the dye stuff called tsukumo. So you can see that, and you can see how there's still some clumps here, but and this is what we take, and this is what we use in starting the vat, and where all the color comes from. So when we're ready to dye something, like I said earlier, you wet out the material. This is maybe counterintuitive for those of you who haven't dyed things, but if you think about it, when you're, if you dye cloth, it's going to be something that you wash and you don't want the color to wash out. So dyes are actually not soluble in water. So before I dye anything, I wet it out, and this allows the color to go into the cloth very evenly.
While you're getting that cloth wet, we have a couple of questions about the plants. One that is very, with the indigo plants, if you pinch off the tops, will it bush out like basil? How do you treat those plants?
So we plant about 5 or 6 plants together, and they do, they will branch out. They do it sort of their own, and then once we let them grow for the first harvest, we don't actually pinch them. And then we cut them off very close to the ground, and they come back much more sort of vigorously and with a lot more stems for the second harvest.
Excellent, thank you. And as you're dipping into this vat, what are these vats made out of? Can we get a more?
Oh, like the physical material of the vat?
Yes.
On the outside, this is stainless steel. And then they're set in concrete. And actually, the fermentation requires the vat to be at about 68 to 70 degrees, which is easy to do in the summer. But in the concrete, we have the studio has a radiant floor, and that's also in this sort of the concrete around the vats, and we use that to keep it warm in the winter. So as I do this here, I'm just going to. When I'm dyeing something, it's just going into the vat and then I'm just gonna keep it under the surface here and move it around and allow the indigo that's been reduced through fermentation in there to adhere to the cloth. One of the things that I want you to see is that the dye vat itself is not blue. It's actually quite brown. If you see the color of that liquid. And that's because of all of the other impurities that are in there from the compost. The composting burns off some of the excess plant material, but really at the end of the day, it's probably about 5% indigo and then a bunch of other plant material. But that plant material and all the other things in there contain the bacteria that are necessary for the fermentation that causes the dyeing. And each of these vats is about 100 gallons, like I said earlier, and it uses about a half bale, or when fresh, 60 some pounds of the composted indigo. One of the things to keep these vats, they're living, they're fermenting. So each day they have to be stirred and to keep them alive. And then slowly over time, as it ferments, the bacteria produce lactic acid, and that lessens the alkalinity of the vat. And so over time, we add more of the wood ash lye or more limestone to keep the alkalinity up. And I'm going to pull this out here in a second, but first I'm going to wring it out underneath the surface. You'll see when it comes out that it's sort of a greenish yellow color. And very quickly, just with oxygen in the air, so that yellow-green color is the indigo in its reduced form. And when I open this up to the air, you'll very quickly be able to see it change from that yellow-green color to blue. I'll try and open this up quickly here.
That was very quick.
Maybe this little bit up here, you can kind of see where it hasn't fully oxidized.
And what kind of fabric is this? What sort of fabric do you use for your work?
This is a cotton, so that's a great question. Indigo really is going to only really adheres to natural fibers, so it doesn't adhere to synthetics. So we use natural fibers. This is just a cotton handkerchief that's very lightweight. So something that will dye. This was something that will dye quite well, quite easily. So once it's dyed, you can kind of see the color of it here. And maybe I'll, and so once it's dyed, I'll bring it over here where I'm gonna rinse it. And I'm gonna just try and rinse half of it so we can kind of see the difference. But I'm gonna put it in the water and you can see sort of the, all the browns, the non-indigo or sort of impurities from the dye bath that are in there rinsing out. And so you're left with just the blue. So when things are done dyeing, we dye them multiple times to build up to the color that we want. And then once they're done dyeing, we simply rinse them and all the blue from the indigo stays in. It's kind of it always feels like magic. So one of the things we do to pattern the cloth, there's lots of different ways to pattern the cloth, but indigo is actually, because of the process that you just saw with the reduction and oxidation, it's a process that doesn't really require much to make a pattern on the cloth. Something very simple can resist the dye, and this is a great example. This is just a same type of handkerchief, just folded between two boards, and those two boards create a resist on the cloth. And then this was folded to create a pattern. You can see some of the brown, the impurity that still hasn't rinsed out. And so then if I open this up, you'll be able to see that it makes a pattern, and we can rinse out all those other impurities. And I'm going to show you some other examples, much more elaborate examples of doing patterning the cloth with just a simple resist like this, where the cloth, just binding the cloth to itself so that the dye can't get in and that it can't oxidize.
Several folks are very curious about the dye not only sticking to the fabric, but about your hands. We had a couple of folks ask about why you don't wear gloves, and someone during your presentation asked about your bare feet in the composting room and how it doesn't turn your feet blue. So how do you not always look like a Smurf with blue hands?
So often I do have blue hands. The composting indigo leaves won't turn your feet blue because the indigo is already oxidized. Remember, it has to be reduced in the vat for it to dye something like cloth or your skin. And yes, my hands are often blue from that. One of the reasons I don't wear gloves, as you saw, when I was working the material, I have to keep it under the surface of the vat. And if I bring it up, it will expose it to oxygen in the air. And if I'm wearing gloves, it's very hard to feel and keep track of the cloth, especially if it's a larger piece of cloth. And then it's very easy to drop it and lose it in the vat. So it's much easier just to not wear gloves, and I can sort of see with my fingers under the vat. So I want to go over here. This is the new vat. It's actually just starting, and it's at a very important time in the process of when it starts to ferment. We started this on Monday, and it reached a point where, like in the photograph that I showed in my presentation, it might be a little hard to see, but down in here, you might be able to see some purple swirls, which is a sign that the indigo in the vat is it's fermenting, and as it hits the surface and the oxygen on the surface, it's reduced and turned blue, and that looks like a purple film on the surface. So at this point, this is the fermentation has started. It's a really good point, and I want to hold it right at that level. So what I do is I add more This is a hydrated lime or slaked lime. And I'm going to add this in. You can see that the vat is sort of eating that away and absorbing it. And then just like I do every day with the other vats, I want to stir. I'm going to stir this in. So like I said, at the end of the day, once all the dyeing's done every day, we have to stir all the vats. And this is what that process looks like. Of course, this vat's only half full. Starting tomorrow night, I'll start filling it up little by little over 3 days until the vat's totally full. And then sometime next week, I'll be able to start using it.
So this is a fresh vat that you're preparing for dyeing, correct?
Yep.
And how do you make some of your large pieces? Someone in the comments noted to your piece that's on view at R&Co right now. How do you make those pieces in what seems to be such a small studio space? So
one of the things with cloth is I use various sort of frames and things like that to suspend the cloth over the vat and put it in. So I don't know if Anand, you can pan up and you can see there's like chains and pulleys and things like that hanging from the ceiling. And I have sort of all sorts of little systems set up to be able to handle much larger things. Like I've been dyeing pieces of 1/4-inch felt that are 10 feet tall and 5 feet wide. And when they're wet, they weigh probably 100 plus 120 pounds, something like that. And I'm able to suspend them and lift them and maneuver them that way. So I also then want to show you a little bit about the economy of the vat. You can see that we have 4 vats set up here. 2 of them are open, 2 of them are covered right now. But typically what we do when we start a vat, we use that whole bag of composted indigo or sukumo. And then little by little over time, as we dye things, the color gets removed from the vat. So we end up, this is a little record book that we keep every day of what's been dyed that day. And one of the things about these vats, maybe this also is sort of an answer to that last question, is that the vats are living, and because they're living, we can only dye so much each day. When we dye with them, we're not only removing the color, but we're also removing the bacteria that cause the fermentation. So if you dye too much in a day, you can kill the vat. But that said, the vats have an incredible longevity. We just threw away a vat on last weekend, so we could start a new one. In that vat, we started like January 5th, 2019. So that vat was well over 2 years old. And we've been using it, quite frequently over those 2+ years. But what happens over time as you're dyeing is you're not only you're removing, as you remove the color, the concentration of color in each vat gets weaker and weaker. So you can see here, this is sort of the oldest vat, and then the next oldest vat, and the next oldest vat, and the newest vat. And what we do when we want to dye something dark, like you can see down here with this range of colors from the vat here, to dye something dark, we basically start in the lightest vat and we dye it in there, and then we move to the next vat and the next vat, and finally we finish in the darkest vat. And what this allows us to do is essentially extract all of the color out of the vats, so that we don't end up wasting any of really the time and energy that we put into growing and composting and fermenting and so on the vats. So it's sort of an economy. The last vat that we threw away, the very last day we used it, we dyed material about 8 times, and there was just no color left. It didn't produce any color at all. But to get shades like this, then we can dye things just in a very light vat, or we can also work all the way through to dark vat. So having a range of vats like this of different concentrations of dye allows us to really get this full sort of gradation of blues that are tricky to get if you just have one vat or a very dark vat. So then
before
finally,
you leave the vats, actually, Roland, we have a few people are very curious about the vats. So before we move to our next one, I want to ask a few while we're still here. What does it smell like? Is it a bad smell with all the fermentation?
That's a good question. So to me, there's a good smell and a bad smell. There's a good fermentation, a bad fermentation. There's one is sort of much more earthy. The other smells like an outhouse in August. So it does smell. I don't know that, to me, the good smell is a good smell and I don't really notice it, but I have had people come to the studio and after 2 or 3 minutes, very politely say, I'm really sorry, but can we talk outside? The smell is a little too much for me. I don't really notice it. I'm very used to it, but it does definitely have a smell.
And then with the fungus that grows, that's obviously part of like what helps the indigo do what it's supposed to do. But is there any medicinal purpose with that?
So with the bacteria, I don't know so much about, but there are lots of historical examples of indigo being used to sort of as bandages for antiseptic properties. And the indigo is also really unique because it's been used, you see it used in work clothes all around the world. And part of the reason for that is simply because unlike most other dyes, because of this reduction and oxidation process, it really is not water soluble. So it doesn't wash out. When you get a lot of the fading you get with it, say on jeans and denim and so on, is actually from scuffing and removing the indigo that's adhered to the surface of the fiber. But indigo coats the fiber and strengthens the cloth. So a lot of antique textiles you'll see where it's been dyed with indigo, it hasn't been eaten away or hasn't fallen apart, but with the areas where it was undyed, that fiber or material could all be gone.
Fantastic. And then one last question that I think is very interesting and maybe a sign of our times, but do you have to keep strong air circulation during the dyeing process and as you're working with the vats?
No, not really. It oxidizes very quickly with just oxygen in the air. So there's really no need to like force oxygen on it or anything. And like I said, I'm so used to the smell that it doesn't faze me at all. So no, we don't.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Great. So I wanted to just show you some other examples of ways of patterning the cloth. And most of these are done with various types of what are called Shibori resists in Japanese. It's a method of somehow just applying pressure to the cloth to create a resist. So in the case of this one, you can see these lines. This cloth was folded. You kind of start to get the idea here as I go along, but you can see how it was folded, and then other cloth was placed on the outside and it was stitched along these lines. And that stitching, you stitch it really tightly, and that stitching cinches the layers of cloth together so no dye can get in, and then it creates this sort of resist. This is another example of something that's been stitched, but in this case, it's long running stitches that run 90 degrees to these lines here. So you stitch through the material back and forth like this, like the whole length, and then you pull the whole thing together really tight. And then only the surface area that's exposed takes the dye. This one's done in a similar method where it's a lot of sort of elaborate folding, but actually no real stitching. It's just folded and folded and folded and folded and then clamped together so that just these outside lines are exposed. And then once it's dyed dark, then all of that is undone and the cloth was dyed to this medium shade underneath it. This is another example. This is the ground cloth here is actually dyed with, the yarn was dyed with persimmon, and then my wife Chinami wove this material. And then this is another one where you can see these sort of stitch marks where the cloth was stitched. But to create this much undyed area, you do a lot of stitching, and then you bind all of the material up and cover it so that just the little bits that were stitched are sticking out. And then you dye the material so that all of this remains resisted. Now you can see the sort of lines and patterns that these create aren't clear. They're not like crisp edges. And if you want to do something where you create crisp edges, you can do something with paste and a stencil. This is a stencil paste resist called katazome in Japanese. And so this is the stencil paper, and you apply paste to the cloth through the stencil, and then wherever the paste is, it doesn't dye. So then when you immerse it in the dye bath, wherever the paste is, resists the dye. But so you dye it, and then when you're done dyeing it, you soak it in water, and it's just a water-based paste. It's made from rice flour and rice bran and salt. And you just dissolves in water and you wash it off. And this is just another example of that, where you can see the resist that's been put in, and then it's been the material's been gradation dyed. So those are some real sort of the sort of bare bones of various ways of patterning the cloth using indigo. Cool. So I'd like to I imagine there's lots of other questions, so I'm going to sit back down at the computer and we'll do my best to answer them.
Fantastic. All right, give me just a minute. There we go. Okay, so we do have lots of questions. The vats especially are something that, and like the dyeing, because I think that's the center of action. So we have a lot of questions around that. How do you maintain a specific pH? Do you have one that you want to maintain, or is that not something that you're paying attention to?
So I don't, yes, I do have to maintain pH. It's really important, but I don't actually measure it. I do that by sort of observing the vats as I'm using them. So the things that, the fermentation, like you need the fermentation to reduce the indigo, but the fermentation produces lactic acid, which brings down the pH. And so does dyeing, brings down the pH, and time as well. Just letting something sit there for a while, the pH will drop. So to maintain the pH, what we do is when we start the vat and we make those 5 batches of the wood ash lye, the strongest batch, we set aside. And over time, you know, some of the liquid in the dye vat will evaporate as you're dyeing things. You kind of inadvertently remove some. So slowly the liquid level in the vat will drop. And about once a week, we add more. We just take from that strongest batch of the lye and add it. And then I also add more of the lime as necessary. Sometimes I'll notice the smell change. Sometimes the surface of the vat will change, and it kind of tells you that it needs, like, the alkalinity is low and you need to add a little more lime or wood ash lye.
Fantastic. And then you kind of touched on it in your presentation at the beginning, and you showed where you empty the vat, but how do you get those vats out of that structure we saw?
That'd be a video that I should shoot one day. So we start by the top liquid in the vat gets pumped from the vat into the cistern out back, where it's then mixed with a lot of water, so it's kind of watered down a bit, and then we pump all that out. We water the garden or the indigo field, whatever needs it, with that liquid. And then at the bottom, though, you have all of the composted indigo, which is really at that point like pond muck. It's like sludge. And so we start just getting buckets, but eventually, like, I just lean over the edge of the vat with my feet up in the air and get down there and scoop it out. It doesn't take that long, and it's actually pretty easy. And then all of that liquid we just put in buckets and carry it out to, if we're going to put it on the field or on a bed in the garden or something like that. So
the vat itself stays in place and you just scoop and drain everything.
Yeah, there's no way we could lift them. I mean, if they're empty, we could lift them out, but they're stainless steel and they're heavy, so we just keep them in place. Yeah.
Excellent. So I'm going to go back to the dyeing questions. She mentioned when the one vat was no more, you tried dipping 8 times, but how often do you typically dip something to get it? Is it dependent on the vat, dependent on the color? Like, just pick a color range that you normally use and talk us through how many times you're going to dip that one.
Right, it depends on a lot of things. So one of the important things that one of the reasons we keep that book is because we need to keep track of how much we're dyeing each day. The vats that we use, I know I can safely dye about 2,400 grams of material. So that's, probably close to 5 pounds, but it's not 5 pounds of material at once. It's like taking, so say I know I can dye 2,400 grams, then I know I could take 240 grams and dye it 10 times. That's what I mean. So part of it is the material that I'm dyeing, how much, and then how much I can dye in the vat each day. So say I'm dyeing 500 grams of material, a little bit more than a pound, I know that I can safely dye that 4, maybe 5 times in a vat. So if I want to build up to a dark color, I might, doing 5 times in each vat, that would allow me to dye it 5 times times 4 vats, 20 times, and that would get to a very, very dark color. As for other shades, it's always a moving target, because the more you use the vats, the more the dye gets removed and the weaker they are. So what you did 2 weeks ago may not be what you do today to get the same shade, because over those 2 weeks, more color will have been removed. So it may require an extra immersion in this vat or that vat, or longer in one of the vats, to really get that same color.
I feel like there's a lot of chemistry in that. So tied to your artistry is some chemistry magic happening.
Yeah, and a lot of just really close observation, and just paying attention. It's really not scientific. You can't say, like, it's not mechanical. You have to, I'm sort of always reacting and rethinking to get a certain color.
I think that's tied to a question someone asked, and it said, this seems like requires a lot of patience. And have you always been a patient person, or has your artistic practice made you a patient person? Or maybe you're not patient at all?
Well, it's kind of interesting, because I don't, like, yes and no. Certain parts of it, yes, but really one of the things is, like, there's always something to be done, right? Whether that's dealing with the plants or it's seasonal, and a lot of it's dictated by the plants and their needs and the seasons. So there's always, like, seeds to be gathered and seeds to be winnowed and seeds to be planted and seedlings to be transplanted and weeds to keep down in the field and harvesting. And so there's always something to do. So I always feel very engaged. I don't feel like I'm waiting for anything to happen ever. There's always lots to do.
That's exciting. These are in no particular order. I'm kind of reading them as they come in. But this one I think is fun, and I suspect a lot of people are wondering it. Did you dye all the clothes that you were wearing?
I definitely dyed my t-shirts. For a long time I had, and we still kind of do it. We do the first thing we dye in each vat is something for ourselves. So humorously, the expression, the cobbler's children have no shoes.
That's right.
The Japanese equivalent of that is the indigo dyer's white pants. And so for a long time we didn't have any, like, I didn't have anything that I had dyed, and then like, everything gets dirty working in here, things splash and get all over you. So it's just much easier to have something that's already dyed blue and not have to worry about it.
Very smart. We have a question about the paste resist that you'd mentioned when you're going through the different types of resist. And why doesn't it dissolve in the dye? What is the difference between the dye and then the plain water that keeps the paste on there?
That's a great question. So that's very easy to answer. It's really time. So when I'm dyeing cloth with the paste on it, I can only dye it 3 minutes, 3 times. So it's in the vat 3 minutes, 3 times, and then I have to let it fully dry again, which often takes overnight. So dyeing things that way can actually take many, many days to get them dark, because you can only dye them three times each day.
Oh, that is very fascinating. So a couple of folks, and I am very excited for them to learn more about this, because now that they can go see it. Tell us a little bit more about your Renwick installation.
Yeah, so the installation at the Renwick started as it was a project that I did in Japan in 2018. I was invited by the prefectural government of Tokushima, which is where indigo is still grown and processed, was historically and still is grown and processed on the largest scale in Japan. And that's where I apprenticed. And I was invited to do a project, and they had seen some work that I had been doing with fading. And as you can imagine, if there's any conservators in the group here tonight, fading is something that museums fight against. People who own things fight against. And is a place where indigo, Tokushima is a place where indigo has been grown and processed for 450, 500 years. You can imagine that there's a lot of concern about fading. And I got very interested in fading, not so much as a negative thing, but really as this, it's really almost like a photographic exposure. And really, as an artist, I kind of started out working with photography initially. So I was very kind of interested in this idea of the way that something fades when it's exposed to light and what's happening in that exchange. It's almost like a breathing. The color from the cloth enters into the world, and like a photograph, sort of this light and air and all these other things get captured on the cloth, which is sort of like photographic film. And so I wanted to do something with, I've been working with that and had been thinking about other ways of using it. And then folks in Tokushima reached out and were like, can we do something with that? So we started brainstorming and came up with this idea of working with folks in first in Tokushima, but then really around the world, who were interested in living with a piece of this cloth, indigo dyed cloth, for we ended up for 5 months. And just keeping it in their lives for 5 months, so that over that time, the color was entering into their lives, and their lives were entering into the cloth through this through the mark of fading. And then we brought them all back together for an installation in early 2018, and sort of set them up in a space that was really kind of like being inside the box that the cloth was faded in. So it was very dark. And one of the things that really struck me about the installation, one of the challenges of doing installations is that you can never really see them until they're up. So there's a huge risk in any installation, because you plan it and you come up with all these ideas, but then until you put it up, you don't really get to see it. And once it was up, being able to spend time with it and really capturing, it really captured this sense of breath, not only in its overall form, but also in the way that it moves and interacts with people moving through the space. So it doesn't, if you walk by, one piece of cloth doesn't move, the whole thing sort of moves and breathes and engages with you in that way. So it's really sort of this, at the end of the day, it kind of becomes this collection of people's lives coming together, this sort of snapshot of their lives in that point in time coming together to create something larger. And that's something that I'm always quite interested in. I think that with a lot of traditions, and craft traditions in particular, we tend to think of like, oh, this person does this thing, and that's really neat, and that's kind of their thing. But in fact, if you look around, indigo is not one person's idea. It's been around a very, very long time, millennia. And it's found all around the world. It's been used by cultures all around the world. So there's something that really can connect us all through the color.
Fantastic. And for folks who want to hear you talk about that more in depth, there was a conversation you had with Emily Zilber with the Renwick and the George Washington University Museum and the Textile Museum. We partnered back, I want to say December, but this feels like a very long time ago. But that is archived both on the Renwick's website as well as the Textile Museum's website. So I encourage folks to seek that out and hear you talk really in depth about that installation. We have just a few more minutes. And so I want to ask you something that a lot of folks are really curious about, and your relationship to the traditional Japanese dyeing process, how you became, this is like 4 questions all crammed into one, because we only have a few minutes left. And so how is your process related to the traditional Japanese process? And what drew you there? What was so interesting to you about indigo that you ended up in Japan and exploring the process there?
Yeah, so to start at the 2021 end of that, I still use this process that I learned in Japan because it's a process that evolved in a temperate climate, which is very, very similar to where I live now. So it's a process that I can use without any added energy. A lot of the other indigos that are grown around the world are tropical or subtropical, and they would require a lot of extra inputs to grow them well where I live. So this is a process that, because it evolved in a temperate climate, just works without any extra inputs, nothing. I can dry stuff in the sun, I can compost them in the winter. It works with where where I live. I got interested in this actually, like I said earlier, I started out as a photographer, and when I went to Japan right after I graduated from college, I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. And I went and I was teaching English at a public high school. And the school had a darkroom, and I'd studied some photography. I was really interested in, this is way pre-digital, so all film. And I was shooting all black and white. And I'd started the photography club with the kids at school and taught them about developing film and printing black and white. And at the same time, I found an old farmhouse in the countryside and rented it and fixed it up and moved in. And very quickly realized that all of the gray water from my house went directly into the stream behind my house. And I started asking around, and it turned out that this was true for where the high school was as well. So there was no all the separate from sewage, but all the gray water. So from bath water and washing dishes and all that stuff, washing your clothes and stuff, went right into the streams and rivers. And this was also the case for all the chemicals we were putting down the drain in the darkroom at the high school. And it very quickly opened my eyes to this connection between our making and the environment and its impact on the environment, that I think in highly developed consumer societies, we work very hard to put a great distance between ourselves and the way things are made. We don't see it, and that creates a blindness necessary for us to be able to consume on the level that we consume at. And so I immediately stopped doing photography. I met some folks who worked with, who were working with natural dyes. They lived way out in the mountains on a top of a sort of hamlet that was all these terraced rice fields in the mountains, and people's houses, interspersed in the rice fields. They lived at the top. And so anything that they used in the dyeing process, and they would just throw it out. It would go right into the rice fields around their house and then trickle down to everybody else's fields. So they were very, very conscious about the types of mordants, the plants they were using. And they really opened my eyes to the possibilities of natural dyes. And they did not work with indigo, but they said, oh, there is this other dye called indigo. I knew nothing about it at the time. It sounds silly now because it's like this huge global phenomenon that's been around for thousands and thousands of years, but I knew nothing about it. And they said, it's still done in Japan, and you can, and so that's how I first learned about it and first got interested in it. And it just, I was very, very fortunate that I was able to go to Tokushima and apprentice there and learn how this is done. And I still use that same process because I think it's really, there's a lot of reasons, but I think there's something very profound about being able to start with a handful of seeds and make something. It takes that distance of making that we put between ourselves and the things we consume in our culture and just shrinks it down right to my own hands. And I can understand that. I can't understand how synthetic dyes are made. I mean, I could probably go get a PhD in it and figure it out, but to really understand how petroleum is extracted, and could I do that on my own? And then synthesize it into dyes and so on. No. And then there's all the, sort of negative impacts of those things as well. So I guess I continue to work with it because it fits where I live. And it's also a really, to me, it feels like a very sort of profound knowledge to be connected with.
That's amazing. So we have time for one more question, and connected to that, can you talk to us a little bit about who works in your studio with you? You've mentioned your wife, your family. Who else is there, and what is that collective process like?
So I have one studio assistant who helps out with dyeing. We also, because the vats are living and we can use them every day, you can actually produce quite a bit. So we do some custom dyeing for a yarn company. We do some custom dyeing for some different clothing companies. All sort of very small batches of things. And so I have an assistant who comes in and helps with those things, with that dyeing.
Fantastic. And I know there's so many unanswered questions. Thank you all for all of your really interesting and great questions for Rowland. You can check out his website, where he has lots of information about the process and dyeing and all of the work that he does. You can also see his work on view at the Renwick Gallery, and if you get your timed tickets. So we are excited to welcome you back. And on behalf of everyone behind the scenes at the Smithsonian American Art Museum and Renwick Gallery, thank you, Rowland, for joining us this evening and for taking us around your studio and really talking us step by step through your process. It was really exciting and interesting, and I have learned so much more about indigo. And I am excited to see more of your work in other places. And for those of you who are joining us tonight, if you are interested in learning more about all of the other programs that we offer, we encourage you to sign up for our newsletter. You can find that chat in, or that link in the chat. And we also are able to produce programs like this because of donations from folks like you. So in addition to the Smithsonian Women's Committee and their generous support of all of our public programs and partners like the George Washington University Museum and Textile Museum, your donations of any size help us make these public programs possible and free and open to everyone. So we ask you to consider donating to us today. Thank you, Rowland, again. Thank you to all of the folks behind the scenes, and thank you, audience, for joining us. I hope you have a fantastic evening.
Thank you.